The steel deck of USS Constellation shimmered like molten metal under the brutal Pacific sun as chaos erupted across the carrier's massive command center. What nobody aboard that floating fortress knew was that they were about to witness the most shocking security breach in modern naval history, one that would leave a decorated admiral questioning everything he thought he knew about the woman he'd just thrown off his ship. But before we dive into this incredible story that'll leave you absolutely speechless, make sure you're subscribed to those who left a trace for more unbelievable military stories that will blow your mind. Hit that notification bell, because you won't want to miss what happens when this admiral realizes he's just made the biggest mistake of his 30-year career. Lieutenant Kate Morrison stood rigid at attention in Admiral Harrison Blackwell's quarters, her 5 feet 6 inches frame perfectly aligned in military precision that would have impressed even the most demanding drill instructor. At 28, she possessed an athletic build that spoke of countless hours maintaining Navy fitness standards, her muscles toned from daily workouts in the ship's cramped but well-equipped gym. Her standard-issue Navy uniform was pressed to perfection, every crease sharp enough to cut paper, every button polished to a mirror shine. Her dark brown hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, so tight it could pass the most stringent inspection, not a single strand out of place despite the humidity and heat of the Pacific deployment. Her green eyes, sharp and analytical like cut emeralds, stared straight ahead with the disciplined focus that had carried her through 6 years of what everyone believed was exemplary but unremarkable naval service. A small star tattoo on her left wrist remained hidden beneath her sleeve, a marking that would soon prove more significant than anyone aboard this massive carrier could possibly imagine. Admiral Harrison Blackwell paced behind his mahogany desk, like a caged predator sizing up his prey, his heavy footsteps echoing in the spacious quarters that befitted his rank and authority. At 54, his weathered face bore the deep lines and permanent scowl of a man who'd spent 25 years commanding respect through sheer force of will and uncompromising authority that brooked no dissent from any subordinate. His silver-gray hair was cropped in the same military style he'd worn since his days as a young midshipman at the Naval Academy, and his chest displayed an impressive collection of ribbons and commendations that told the story of a distinguished career built on unwavering dedication to protocol and absolute adherence to the chain of command that was a backbone of naval discipline. When Admiral Blackwell spoke, people listened with rapt attention. When he gave orders, they were followed without question, without hesitation, and certainly without the kind of insubordination he'd witnessed this morning. That's how it had always been aboard his vessels, and that's exactly how he intended it to remain until the day he retired from active duty. Morrison, you're relieved of duty, effective immediately. Blackwell's voice cut through the air like a ceremonial sword slicing through silk. Your insubordination during this morning's briefing was completely unacceptable and frankly insulting to every officer in that room who's earned their position through years of dedicated service and proven judgment. I don't care what you think you know about weapons systems or missile protocols or targeting sequences. When I give an order, it gets followed without question, without hesitation, and certainly without some lieutenant who's been aboard my ship for 3 months thinking she knows better than a man with 3 decades of naval experience and combat command. Kate's expression remained perfectly neutral, though something flickered behind those analytical green eyes like lightning in a storm cloud. A brief spark that might have been surprise, or perhaps something else entirely that would have given the Admiral pause if he'd been paying closer attention to details rather than focusing on his own wounded pride. Sir, I was merely pointing out a potential safety concern with the Tomahawk targeting sequence. She replied in measured tones that betrayed nothing of her inner thoughts or calculations running through her mind like a computer processing critical data. You were questioning my judgment in front of my entire command staff. Blackwell shot back, his voice rising with each word until it echoed off the bulkheads of his quarters. That's not how things work on my ship, Lieutenant. This isn't some democracy where junior officers get to vote on operational decisions. You pack your gear and report to the next available transport off this vessel. Your transfer papers will be processed within the hour, and I'll make damn sure your next commanding officer knows exactly why you're being reassigned and what kind of officer they're getting. The massive aircraft carrier USS Constellation stretched out beneath them like a floating city of steel and determination, its nuclear-powered engines driving the 97,000-ton vessel through Pacific waters at a steady 25 knots. Home to over 5,000 sailors and Marines, the ship represented the pinnacle of American naval power, capable of projecting force anywhere in the world's oceans. From the flight deck where S/A-18 Super Hornets stood ready for launch to the depths of the engine room, where nuclear reactors provided unlimited power, every inch of the carrier was designed for one purpose: maintaining American dominance on the high seas. But today, in the Admiral's quarters high above the flight deck, that awesome power was about to be challenged by something far more dangerous than any enemy weapon: the truth. What would you do in this situation? Comment below if you think this admiral is making a huge mistake that's about to blow up in his face. Because what happens next will shock you to your very core and change everything you think you know about military command authority. The trouble had begun 3 hours earlier during the morning briefing in the carrier's primary conference room, a sterile space dominated by electronic displays and tactical charts that could coordinate naval operations across thousands of square miles of ocean. Admiral Blackwell had outlined what he described as a critical training exercise involving a simulated missile strike against a designated target approximately 800 nautical miles southeast of their current position in international waters. The scenario called for the launch of 2 Tomahawk cruise missiles at precisely 1,400 hours, with the exercise designed to test the ship's response time and targeting accuracy under pressure. It was supposed to be a routine drill that the Admiral had overseen dozens of times before during his command of the Constellation. But something about today's parameters had immediately caught Kate's trained attention in ways that would have surprised everyone in that room. As Admiral Blackwell detailed the targeting coordinates and launch sequence with the confidence of a man who'd never been seriously challenged, Kate had noticed a discrepancy in the safety protocols that made her blood run cold. The proposed flight path would take the cruise missiles dangerously close to a civilian shipping lane that wasn't scheduled to be cleared until 14:30 hours, a full 30 minutes after planned launch time. It was a window of potential disaster that could put innocent merchant vessels at risk, and naval regulations clearly stated that all civilian traffic must be verified clear before any live missile exercises could commence. The regulations existed for good reason, written in the blood of past mistakes that the Navy was determined never to repeat. But when Kate had respectfully raised her hand to point out this potentially deadly oversight, Admiral Blackwell had shut her down with the swift brutality of a man and used to having his authority questioned. "Lieutenant Morrison," he'd said with barely concealed irritation that made several senior officers shift uncomfortably in their seats, "I've been conducting missile exercises since before you knew what ship was, much less how to serve aboard one. If I want your input on matters of naval strategy and weapons deployment, I'll ask for it specifically. Until then, I suggest you focus on learning rather than teaching." The conference room had fallen silent as a tomb, and Kate had felt the eyes of every senior officer boring into her like laser beams. She could sense their discomfort with the Admiral's dismissive response, but none of them were willing to challenge their commanding officer's judgment, especially not in front of a junior officer who'd just been publicly humiliated. But Kate couldn't let it go, not when lives might be hanging in the balance. Her training, both official and unofficial, had taught her that sometimes doing the right thing meant accepting personal consequences for speaking truth to power. "Sir, with all due respect," she'd said quietly, her voice steady despite the hostile atmosphere in the room, "the shipping lane won't be verified clear until 14:30 hours. Perhaps we could delay the launch by 30 minutes to ensure no civilian vessels are in the danger zone when our missiles transit through that area." That's when Admiral Blackwell had erupted like a volcano that had been building pressure for months. 30 years of naval command, and now I'm getting tactical advice from a lieutenant who probably learned everything she knows from computer simulations and classroom theory rather than real-world experience in actual combat situations. "You're completely out of line, Morrison, and you're relieved of duty effective immediately. Security will escort you from this briefing, and you'll be off my ship before the day is through." Now, standing in his quarters 3 hours later, listening to her career being systematically dismantled by a superior officer whose pride had been wounded, Kate maintained her military bearing even as her mind raced through the implications of what was happening. She'd always been a by-the-book officer in her official capacity, following orders and protocols to the letter with the kind of precision that earned commendations and positive fitness reports. But she'd also been trained by people whose existence was never officially acknowledged, people who'd taught her to speak up when safety was at risk, regardless of the personal cost. Everything in her training, both official and classified, told her that today's exercise parameters were not just dangerous, but potentially catastrophic. Sir, if I may ask respectfully, Kate began carefully, choosing each word like a munitions expert defusing a bomb. Will the shipping lane clearance be verified before the 1400 launch time? Or are we proceeding based on the assumption that civilian traffic will have cleared the area by then? Admiral Blackwell's face flushed red with anger that made the veins in his temples pulse visibly. You may not ask anything, Lieutenant. Your opinion is neither requested nor welcome in matters of operational planning. You're dismissed from this vessel and from any involvement in this exercise or any other operation under my command. Security will escort you to your quarters to pack your personal effects, and you'll be on the next transport helicopter off my ship. I don't want to see your face or hear your voice again. As if summoned by his words like genies emerging from a bottle, two master-at-arms appear at the door to Admiral Blackwell's quarters, their presence both professional and intimidating. Lieutenant Morrison, sir, one of them said with the neutral tone that military police used when they weren't sure whether they were dealing with a criminal or just someone who'd pissed off the wrong superior officer. We're here to escort you to pack your personal effects and prepare for immediate transfer off the vessel. Kate nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement that somehow managed to convey both respect for their authority and defiance of the Admiral's decision. Yes, sir, she said to the master-at-arms, then turned back to Admiral Blackwell. Admiral, she said quietly, her voice carrying undertones that a more perceptive man might have recognized as a warning. I sincerely hope today's exercise proceeds safely and that all personnel, both military and civilian, remain out of harm's way. It was a simple statement on the surface, but something in her tone made Admiral Blackwell's jaw clench with irritation that went beyond mere anger into something approaching paranoia. There was a certainty in her voice, a confidence that suggested she knew something he didn't, and that possibility rankled him more than her original insubordination had. Get her off my ship, he barked to the security personnel with unnecessary vehemence. I want her gone within the hour. 45 minutes later, Kate stood on a massive flight deck of USS Constellation with her duffel bag slung over her shoulder, waiting for the helicopter that would take her away from the carrier that had been her home for the past 3 months. The Pacific wind whipped across the massive vessel's deck with enough force to knock down an unprepared sailor, and she could see crew members throughout the ship preparing for the afternoon's missile exercise with the kind of precise choreography that made naval operations look effortless to outside observers. Her replacement had already been briefed by Admiral Blackwell personally and was undoubtedly reviewing the same flawed protocols that had gotten her dismissed from the ship. Part of her wanted to try one more time to get anyone, to listen to her concerns about the civilian shipping lane, but she knew it would be pointless. Admiral Blackwell had made his decision with the finality of a man who'd never learned to admit when he might be wrong, and nothing short of a direct order from a higher authority would change his mind now. The helicopter's rotors were already spinning with increasing velocity when Kate's secure communication device, a piece of equipment that looked like a standard-issue Navy radio but contained technology that most officers aboard the carrier had never seen, buzzed with an incoming priority message. She glanced at the small screen and felt her blood run cold as ice water flowed through her veins. The message was from Naval. Intelligence, transmitted through channels so secure that their very existence was classified above most admirals' clearance levels, and it contained information that changed everything about today's exercise in ways that would make Admiral Blackwell's shipping lane concern seem trivial by comparison. The message was brief but devastating. Priority Alpha. Exercise target confirmed occupied by civilian contractors. Satellite imagery shows 12 to 15 personnel on platform. Mission parameters compromised. Abort immediately. But as Kate looked up at the helicopter preparing to take her away from the ship, watching the crew members below making final preparations for a missile launch that was now revealed to be a potential massacre, she realized she might already be too late to prevent a disaster that will haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. Get ready, because what happens next will leave you absolutely stunned and questioning everything you thought you knew about military command structure. Smash that like button if you're ready to see this admiral learn the biggest lesson of his 30-year military career. And don't forget to tell us in the comments what you think should happen next. Back in the ship's Combat Information Center, a high-tech nerve center that controlled the most sophisticated weapon systems on Earth. The crew was making final preparations for the 1,400 hours missile launch with the kind of professional competence that had made the United States Navy the dominant force on the world's oceans. Radar operators monitored their screens with unwavering attention, tracking every aircraft and surface vessel within hundreds of miles of their position. Weapon systems technicians ran through their pre-launch checklists with the methodical precision of people who knew that a single mistake could have catastrophic consequences. The atmosphere was tense but confident, filled with the kind of controlled energy that came with executing a well-rehearsed military operation that they'd drilled countless times before. Admiral Blackwell stood at the center of it all, like a conductor preparing to lead a deadly symphony, hands clasped behind his back in a posture that projected absolute authority and confidence. He watched his crew work with the satisfaction of a commander who knew his people were among the best trained and most professional in the Navy. These weren't just sailors. They were the elite of the elite, handpicked for service aboard one of America's most powerful warships. Every man and woman in the Combat Information Center had earned their position through years of training and proven competence under pressure. Commander Sarah Collins, the ship's executive officer and a rising star in the Navy hierarchy, approached Admiral Blackwell with a clipboard containing the final launch checklist. At 38, she represented the new generation of naval officers, highly educated, technically proficient, and absolutely dedicated to the mission. Admiral, we're T-minus 15 minutes to launch, she reported with crisp efficiency. All systems are green across the board. Targeting solutions are locked in, and the Tomahawk missiles are armed and ready for launch on your command. Excellent work, Commander. Blackwell nodded approvingly, his chest swelling with pride at the smooth operation unfolding around him. This is exactly the kind of precision and professionalism that our new crew members need to see. When we execute this launch, it will demonstrate the awesome power and capability of American naval forces to project power anywhere in the world, execute the launch sequence on my direct command, and ensure all departments are recording data for post-exercise analysis. What Admiral Blackwell didn't know, couldn't have known given the layers of security and deception that surrounded the truth, was that 200 feet above him on the flight deck, Kate Morrison was having a very different conversation with the helicopter pilot. The priority message on her secure device had contained intelligence that transformed the routine training exercise into something far more sinister and dangerous. The target wasn't just an abandoned oil platform being used for target practice. It was a live operational site that intelligence agencies had been monitoring for weeks as part of a complex counterterrorism operation. According to classified information flooding her secure device, the platform had indeed been evacuated 2 days ago when intelligence suggested it might be targeted by terrorist operatives. But what Admiral Blackwell's briefing materials hadn't included, couldn't have included without compromising ongoing intelligence operations, was that civilian contractors had returned to the platform that very morning to conduct emergency repairs on safety systems that, if left unfixed, could cause an environmental disaster far worse than anything terrorists might accomplish. Kate had tried calling the ship's communications center using standard channels, but her calls were being blocked on Admiral Blackwell's direct orders. The Admiral had made it clear to his communication staff that any contact from the dismissed Lieutenant Morrison was to be ignored and reported to security as potential harassment of ship's personnel. She was effectively cut off from the ship's command structure, watching helplessly as they prepared to launch cruise missiles at a target that contained innocent people who had no idea they were about to become victims of a training exercise gone catastrophically wrong. That's when Kate Morrison made a decision that would change everything about her mission and her life. She asked a helicopter pilot, a veteran aviator who'd seen enough strange situations to know when not to ask questions, to circle back toward the ship and requested emergency communication access using a code that most people aboard USS Constellation had never heard before. It was a code that existed in the deepest levels of naval intelligence, buried in classified protocols that were known only to select few officers who operated in the shadowy world where military operations intersected with intelligence gathering and covert action. This is Lieutenant Morrison requesting emergency communication access using authentication code Alpha 7-7 Charlie 9, she said into the helicopter's radio system, her voice carrying an authority that made the pilot's eyes widen with surprise. I need immediate priority access to Admiral Blackwell, and I need it now. The communications officer who received that transmission would later describe the moment as the most surreal of his naval career. Alpha 7-7. Charlie, 9 wasn't just any authentication code. It was a naval intelligence override that very few people in the Navy even knew existed, and fewer still were authorized to use under any circumstances. The code was designed for situations where intelligence operatives needed to override normal command authority to prevent catastrophic mistakes that could compromise national security or result in massive loss of life. Ma'am, the communications officer responded, his voice tight with confusion and growing alarm. That code, I need to verify with my superiors. Please stand by while I authenticate your authorization. You don't have time to verify anything. Kate replied with cold precision that cut through his uncertainty like a laser through steel. That code gives me immediate access to your commanding officer, regardless of my current status aboard the vessel. Naval Intelligence Protocol 7 Alpha is now in effect, and every second you delay puts lives at risk. The communications officer's hand shook as he checked his classified protocols manual, a thick binder that contained procedures for situations that were supposed to never actually occur in the real world. But there it was in black and white. Any officer using Alpha 7-7 Charlie 9 authentication must be given immediate access to the commanding officer, regardless of their current status, assignment, or any previous orders to the contrary. In the Combat Information Center, Admiral Blackwell was counting down the final minutes to launch when a senior communications officer approached with a face as pale as fresh snow and hands that trembled slightly despite his years of experience handling classified materials. Sir, we have an emergency communication from Lieutenant Morrison. She's using an Alpha 7-7 Charlie 9 authentication code, and naval protocols require that I put her through to you immediately. Blackwell's face contorted with rage that made several nearby officers step back instinctively. I told you specifically, no communications from that officer under any circumstances. She's relieved of duty and off this ship. I don't care what code she's using. She has no authority here anymore. Sir, the communications officer insisted, his voice shaking with the knowledge that he was about to contradict the flag officer. Alpha 7-7 Charlie, 9 codes cannot be ignored under any circumstances. Naval regulations require that any officer using that authentication must be given immediate access to the commanding officer, regardless of their current status or any previous orders. This isn't optional. Sir, it's mandatory. What the hell is an Alpha 7-7 Charlie 9 code? Blackwell demanded, his voice carrying across the Combat Information Center and causing conversations to stop as personnel turned to listen to an exchange that was unlike anything they'd witnessed in their naval careers. It's a naval intelligence override, sir, the communications officer explained, consulting his manual with shaking hands. I've never seen one used before in my 15 years of service, but the regulations are absolutely clear. We have to put her through, regardless of any other considerations. Admiral Blackwell stared at his communications officer for a long moment, his mind racing through the implications of what he was hearing. In 30 years of naval service, including commands in combat zones and high-security operations, he'd never encountered this particular code either. But if naval regulations required compliance, and if his communications officer was reading the protocols correctly, he had no choice but to follow procedures that had been established by people with far more authority than even a carrier admiral possessed. Put her through, he said finally, his voice tight with controlled anger and growing apprehension. But I want a full investigation into how a dismissed officer obtained access to naval intelligence codes that I've never even heard of in 3 decades of service. Admiral Blackwell. Kate's voice came through the ship's communication system with crystal clarity that carried to every corner of the Combat Information Center. I need you to abort the missile launch immediately. The target platform contains civilian personnel who returned to the site this morning for emergency repairs. If you proceed with this launch, you will be responsible for the deaths of at least 12 innocent people. Lieutenant Morrison, Blackwell replied coldly, his voice echoing to the Combat Information Center, where every technician and operator had stopped their work to listen to this unprecedented exchange. You are relieved of duty and no longer part of this operation, or any operation under my command. Your opinion is neither requested nor relevant to operational decisions that are made by officers with the authority and experience to make them. Sir, this is an opinion or suggestion. Kate's voice came back to the speakers with unwavering certainty. I have real-time satellite imagery from 57 minutes ago showing active personnel on the platform conducting emergency repairs on critical safety systems. These are civilian contractors who return to prevent an environmental disaster. If you launch those missiles, you won't just be killing innocent people. You'll be causing exactly the kind of ecological catastrophe they're working to prevent. The Combat Information Center fell completely silent except for the hum of electronic equipment and the distant sound of the carrier's engines driving them through Pacific waters. Every operator, every technician, every officer stopped what they were doing and listened to the exchange between their admiral and the lieutenant he'd just thrown off the ship. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, and several personnel found themselves holding their breath as they witnessed a confrontation that would be talked about in naval circles for years to come. Where'd you get access to real-time satellite imagery? Blackwell demanded, his voice carrying a note of suspicion that made it clear he was beginning to understand that Lieutenant Morrison was not who she appeared to be. And how did you obtain an Alpha 7-7 Charlie 9 authentication code that requires clearances above my own level? That information is classified above your current clearance level, Admiral, but I can verify my authority to access it. Kate replied with cold professionalism. I strongly recommend that you check my complete service record using your Alpha 7-7 Charlie 9 access codes. You'll find information there that wasn't included in my standard personnel file, information that explains exactly who I am and why I have the authority to override your operational decisions when civilian lives are at stake. Admiral Blackwell felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the Combat Information Center. Something about Kate's tone had fundamentally changed from the deferential lieutenant who'd been questioning his orders 2 hours ago. This voice carried authority, confidence, and something else that made his hand shake slightly as he reached a secure terminal that could access the highest levels of classified personnel information in the naval database. I don't know what game you're playing, Morrison, but this exercise proceeds as planned, he said, though his voice carried less conviction than it had minutes earlier. We launch in 6 minutes, and nothing you say is going to change that decision. Sir, Kate's voice came back with a kind of steely determination that made everyone in the Combat Information Center understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented in naval history. Under Naval Intelligence Protocol 7 Alpha, I am officially ordering you to abort this launch until the target can be verified clear of all civilian personnel. This is not a request. It's a direct order from someone with the authority to give it. The words hit Admiral Blackwell like a physical blow that left him momentarily speechless. Naval Intelligence Protocol 7 Alpha was something he'd heard whispered about in the highest levels of command, a theoretical procedure that was rumored to give certain intelligence officers authority that could override even fleet commanders under specific circumstances involving potential civilian casualties or national security breaches. But he'd never seen it invoked, never thought he'd encounter a situation where such extreme measures would be necessary. Admiral, his communications officer said quietly, his voice barely audible above the electronic humming of the Combat Information Center. I'm showing verification of Lieutenant Morrison's Alpha 7-7 Charlie 9 credentials in the system. Her complete service record is... It's mostly classified, sir. Far above my clearance level, and apparently above standard command clearances as well. Blackwell's hands trembled as he accessed his own high-level security clearance and pulled up Kate Morrison's complete service record from the Naval Personnel Database. What he saw on that screen made his face go white as fresh snow and his legs feel weak enough that he had to grab the edge of a nearby console for support. This wasn't just any lieutenant who'd been questioning his authority. This was Lieutenant Catherine Morrison, Naval Intelligence, with commendations and assignments that were so highly classified, he could barely access them even with his admiral's clearance level. Jesus Christ, he whispered, staring at the screen that detailed operations and assignments that read like something from a spy novel. Morrison, what the hell are you really? I'm someone who's been trying to prevent you from making a catastrophic mistake that would end your career and possibly result in an international incident. Admiral, Kate replied to the communication system. Now, please, for the sake of those civilian contractors and your own future, abort the launch and verify the target status through proper intelligence channels. Lives depend on the decision you make in the next 30 seconds. Wait, before you go, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your city or country in the comments. We want to see how far this incredible story has traveled. And hey, if this twist caught you off guard, hit that like button so we know you're loving these shocking reveals that prove nothing is ever what it seems in the military. Admiral Blackwell's mind raced as he processed what he was seeing on a secure terminal screen. Kate Morrison's real service record was like nothing he'd ever encountered in 3 decades of naval service. The document showed naval intelligence operations in classified locations around the world, commendations from a Pentagon that were sealed at security levels above his own clearance, and training certifications in specialties that most officers didn't even know existed within the Navy's organizational structure. She wasn't just some lieutenant questioning his authority. She was a deep-cover intelligence operative whose real rank and authority were hidden behind multiple layers of security classifications that went to the very top of the military hierarchy. All stations, belay missile launch immediately, Blackwell commanded, his voice suddenly hoarse with the realization of how close he'd come to making an irreversible mistake. I repeat, abort launch sequence immediately. Stand down all weapon systems and secure the missiles. This is not a drill. The Combat Information Center erupted in confused activity as technicians began rapidly powering down the launch systems with a kind of urgent efficiency that suggested everyone understood they were dealing with a serious situation. Commander Collins approached her admiral with obvious confusion written across her face and concern evident in her voice. "Sir, are we scrubbing the exercise?" she asked, her training telling her to follow orders without question while her curiosity demanded to know what had caused such a dramatic reversal of a carefully planned operation. "Get me updated satellite imagery of the target platform immediately," Blackwell ordered, his voice carrying a new note of urgency that made everyone in the Combat Information Center understand that something fundamental had changed. "I want real-time reconnaissance at the highest resolution available, and I want it 5 minutes ago. Also, patch me through to Naval Intelligence Command immediately on the most secure channel available." While his crew scrambled to comply with orders that seemed to come from a different admiral than the one who'd been confidently counting down to missile launch just minutes earlier, Admiral Blackwell continued studying Kate's classified record with growing amazement and horror at his own ignorance. According to what he was reading, Lieutenant Kate Morrison had spent the last 2 years embedded in various naval operations as a deep-cover intelligence asset whose primary mission was monitoring and preventing exactly the kind of civilian casualty incidents that could trigger international diplomatic crises and undermine American military credibility around the world. Her public service record showing routine assignments to various ships and installations was completely fabricated, a cover story designed to allow her to operate within normal naval command structures while conducting intelligence operations that were vital to national security. Her real work involved infiltrating military operations to identify and correct systematic problems that could lead to catastrophic mistakes, the kind of errors in judgment that could end careers, destroy lives, and potentially start wars. "Admiral," the radar operator called out, his voice tight with the kind of professional concern that suggested he was seeing something on his screen that didn't match the briefing materials they'd been given. "I have Lieutenant Morrison's helicopter on approach vector to the ship. She's requesting immediate permission to land on the flight deck." "Negative," Blackwell responded automatically, his ingrained authority asserting itself before his rational mind could process the situation. Then he caught himself, realizing that everything he thought he knew about Kate Morrison had just been revealed as carefully constructed fiction. "Actually, grant permission immediately. Have security escort her directly to my quarters the moment she touches down, and clear the corridors between the flight deck and my cabin. I want no interference with her movement through the ship." 30 minutes later, Kate Morrison stood once again in Admiral Blackwell's quarters, but this time the dynamic between them had shifted so dramatically that they might as well have been different people occupying the same space. She was no longer the insubordinate lieutenant facing dismissal for questioning authority. She was a naval intelligence operative whose true identity and mission were becoming clearer with each passing moment. Her green eyes met the Admiral's gaze steadily, and for the first time since she'd come aboard his ship, Blackwell saw something in him that made him deeply uncomfortable. The calm confidence of someone who'd been 3 steps ahead of him from the very beginning of their relationship. "Lieutenant Morrison," Blackwell began, then stopped himself as he realized that even her rank might be part of the elaborate deception that had been played out aboard his ship. "Or should I be addressing you by a different rank that reflects your actual position in the naval hierarchy?" "Lieutenant is correct for this particular assignment, sir," Kate replied evenly, her voice carrying the kind of professional detachment that suggested she'd had this conversation before with other commanding officers who discovered her true identity. "Though my operational authority in matters involving civilian safety and potential international incidents does supersede normal chain of command under specific protocols that you're now becoming familiar with." The updated satellite imagery arrived at that precise moment, displayed on the large screen in Blackwell's quarters with clarity that left no room for doubt or misinterpretation. The oil platform that was supposed to be their target showed unmistakable signs of recent activity. Workboats moored alongside the structure, personnel moving around the deck in the distinctive orange coveralls of civilian contractors, equipment and supplies that had obviously been delivered within the last few hours, and most damning of all, a helicopter that had apparently just completed another supply run and was preparing to depart with a load of workers whose shift had ended. "My God," Blackwell whispered, staring at the screen that showed at least a dozen people going about their work with no idea how close they'd come to being vaporized by American missiles. "There are civilians all over that platform. We would have killed them all. The intelligence briefing your staff received yesterday was deliberately incomplete, Admiral," Kate explained with the kind of clinical precision that suggested she'd been monitoring the situation for far longer than anyone had realized. "This entire scenario was designed as a test of your command protocols, though not the kind of test you thought you were conducting. The platform was indeed evacuated 2 days ago based on intelligence suggesting potential terrorist activity, but civilian contractors were brought back this morning to conduct emergency repairs on safety systems that, if left unfixed, could cause an environmental disaster far worse than anything terrorists might accomplish." Admiral Blackwell felt his legs go weak, and he sat down heavily in his chair as the full implications of what Kate was telling him began to sink in. "You're telling me this entire situation was some kind of elaborate test? The missile exercise, your supposed insubordination, the dismissal, all of it was planned?" "Not all of it was planned, Admiral," Kate said quietly, her professional mask slipping slightly to reveal something that might have been genuine regret. "My concerns about the shipping lane clearance this morning were completely genuine, and they were indeed part of the test parameters that had been established. But my primary mission aboard your ship was to evaluate how you and your command staff respond when junior officers raise legitimate safety issues that conflict with operational plans or challenge the assumptions underlying those plans. And I failed that evaluation spectacularly," Blackwell said, the words tasting bitter in his mouth as he contemplated the implications for his career and his reputation within the Navy hierarchy. "Sir, what happened today revealed dangerous patterns in your command style that could have resulted in civilian casualties under different circumstances," Kate replied with the kind of honest directness that was somehow both brutal and compassionate. "You dismiss valid safety concerns without proper investigation. You relieved a subordinate officer without following established protocols for handling dissent, and you came within minutes of authorizing a missile strike that would have killed innocent people. If this had been a real operational scenario instead of a carefully controlled test, the consequences would have been absolutely catastrophic for everyone involved." Admiral Blackwell stared at the satellite imagery. Watching the tiny figures of civilian workers moving around on the platform, he'd been seconds away from obliterating with enough explosive force to level a city block. The full weight of what had almost happened settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket that threatened to crush him under its moral and professional implications. "How long have you been aboard my ship operating under false pretenses?" he asked, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration for deception and anger at being manipulated without his knowledge. 3 months, sir, Kate replied without hesitation. Long enough to observe multiple concerning patterns in how you handle dissenting opinions from junior officers, how you respond to challenges to your authority, and how you make decisions under pressure when your judgment is questioned. Today's scenario was specifically designed to create maximum pressure and see if those patterns will hold under the kind of stress that commanders face in real combat situations. And they held perfectly, didn't they? Blackwell admitted grimly, facing the uncomfortable truth about his own leadership style. I was so focused on maintaining my authority and demonstrating my command presence that I nearly caused an international incident and killed a dozen innocent people in the process. Kate's expression softened slightly, revealing something more human beneath the professional intelligence operative facade. Sir, the point of this evaluation wasn't to destroy your career or humiliate you personally. It was to identify areas where command protocols and training might need adjustment to prevent exactly these kinds of dangerous situations from occurring in real-world operations where the stakes are even higher. A sharp knock at the door interrupted their conversation before Admiral Blackwell could respond. Admiral, Commander Collins called from outside the cabin. Admiral, Commander Collins called from outside the cabin, her voice carrying a kind of urgency that suggested something significant was happening elsewhere on the ship. Naval Intelligence Command is on the secure line for you, and they're requesting an immediate conference call with you and Lieutenant Morrison. Admiral Blackwell looked at Kate one more time, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time since she'd stepped aboard his ship 3 months ago. She wasn't the insubordinate lieutenant he'd dismissed in anger. She was a highly trained intelligence operative who'd been trying to save him from making the biggest mistake of his distinguished career. The irony was almost overwhelming. The person he'd viewed as his greatest problem had actually been his salvation. This conversation is far from over, Lieutenant Morrison, he said as he moved toward the secure communication console that dominated one wall of his quarters. But first I need to explain to my superiors how I almost launched cruise missiles at a platform full of innocent civilians, because I was too proud and too stubborn to listen to a junior officer's legitimate safety concerns. As Admiral Blackwell reached for the encrypted phone that would connect him directly to the Pentagon, Kate Morrison allowed herself the smallest of smiles. It had been a close call, much closer than she'd anticipated when she'd accepted this assignment. But the test had accomplished its primary objective. One of the Navy's most experienced commanders had learned a lesson that no amount of training, simulations, or classroom instruction could have taught him. That sometimes the most important intelligence comes from the officers you least expect to challenge your fundamental assumptions about command and control. The secure phone call that followed would become legendary in naval intelligence circles for years to come. Admiral Blackwell spent the next hour and 15 minutes explaining his decision-making process to a panel of admirals and intelligence officials who had been monitoring the entire exercise from secure facilities in the Pentagon and Norfolk Naval Base. His brutally honest assessment of his own failures, combined with his immediate willingness to implement new protocols for handling dissenting opinions from subordinate officers, would ultimately save his career and lead to Navy-wide changes in command training and evaluation procedures. Sir, we've been monitoring the situation since Lieutenant Morrison came aboard your vessel 3 months ago. Admiral Richardson's voice came through the secure speaker with the kind of gravity that suggested this conversation would have far-reaching implications. What we witnessed today was both troubling and encouraging in ways that we need to discuss in detail. Troubling because I nearly killed innocent people, Blackwell replied with unflinching honesty, and encouraging because I was stopped before I could complete that mistake by an officer whose warnings I should have heeded from the beginning. Actually, Admiral, the voice of Captain Martinez from Naval Intelligence joined the conversation. What was encouraging was your immediate response once you understood the true nature of the situation. Many commanders in similar circumstances have doubled down on their original decisions rather than admit they might have been wrong. Your willingness to abort the mission and reassess the intelligence showed exactly the kind of adaptability we need in modern naval command. But the most significant change happened right there in Admiral Blackwell's quarters, as he looked at Lieutenant Kate Morrison with newfound respect and understanding that transformed their entire relationship. For 30 years, he commanded through authority and intimidation, using his rank and experience to silence dissent and maintain absolute control over his operations. Today, he'd learned that true leadership wasn't about never being questioned. It was about creating an environment where people felt safe raising concerns that could save lives, prevent disasters, and preserve the honor of the United States Navy. Lieutenant Morrison, he said after ending his call with Naval Intelligence Command, his voice carrying a humility that would have shocked every officer who'd served under his command. "I owe you an apology that goes far beyond what happened in this morning's briefing. You've shown me that real leadership isn't about maintaining absolute authority. It's about having the wisdom to listen when someone is trying to prevent you from making a catastrophic mistake." Kate nodded once, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both forgiveness and continued vigilance. The Navy needs commanders who can adapt to changing circumstances and new information, sir. Today proved that you're capable of exactly that kind of growth and flexibility. "But tell me something, Morrison," Blackwell continued, his curiosity finally overcoming his wounded pride. "How many other ships have you served on in this capacity? How many other commanders have you evaluated without their knowledge? That information is classified, Admiral." Kate replied with a slight smile that suggested she'd been asked this question before. "But I can tell you that your response today was far better than average. Most commanders either ignore the warnings entirely or double down on their mistakes even after being presented with contradictory evidence." As the sun set over the Pacific Ocean, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red that reflected off the carrier's massive flight deck, USS Constellation continued its patrol with a new understanding of how crucial it was to listen to every voice on the crew, regardless of rank, experience, or tenure. Admiral Blackwell had learned perhaps the most important lesson of his long and distinguished career, that the person challenging your assumptions might just be the one preventing your greatest mistake and saving your legacy from disaster. The changes Admiral Blackwell implemented over the following weeks became a model for naval commands throughout the fleet. He established new protocols that required serious consideration of any safety concerns raised by any crew member, regardless of their position in the hierarchy. He instituted regular briefings where junior officers were specifically encouraged to question operational plans and suggest alternatives. Most importantly, he created an atmosphere where dissent was viewed not as insubordination, but as a crucial part of the decision-making process that could prevent catastrophic errors in judgment. 6 months later, Admiral Harrison Blackwell will be promoted to Fleet Commander with specific responsibilities for implementing these new protocols throughout the Pacific Fleet. The changes he instituted based on his experience with Lieutenant Morrison would prevent 3 separate incidents that could have resulted in civilian casualties, international diplomatic crises, and irreparable damage to American military credibility around the world. As for Lieutenant Kate Morrison, she received commendations from the highest levels of naval intelligence for her successful evaluation of command protocols under extreme pressure and her prevention of what could have been a massacre of innocent civilians. Her techniques for identifying and correcting dangerous command patterns will become standard training for intelligence operatives throughout the fleet, and her case study will be taught at the Naval War College for years to come. But perhaps most importantly, she'd proven that sometimes the most critical mission isn't the one you're officially assigned to complete. Sometimes it's the one that requires you to stand up and tell a superior officer that they're about to make a mistake that could cost innocent lives, destroy careers, and undermine everything the military stands for, even when you know that speaking truth to power might end your own career in the process. 3 weeks after the incident, Kate Morrison received new orders that would take her to another ship, another command, another opportunity to evaluate how well the Navy's most experienced officers handled challenges to their authority and judgment. As she packed her gear in preparation for transfer to her next assignment, she reflected on how close they'd all come to tragedy on that day in the Pacific. A few more minutes of stubbornness from Admiral Blackwell, a little more delay in accessing her authentication codes, or any number of small failures in communication could have resulted in the kind of disaster that would have made international headlines and changed naval policy forever. But instead, it had become a learning experience that would make the entire Navy safer and more effective in carrying out its mission to protect American interests around the world. Her secure communication device buzzed with details of her new assignment. Another carrier, another admiral to evaluate, another opportunity to prevent catastrophic mistakes before they happened. Lieutenant Kate Morrison, whose real identity and mission remained known only to a select few people in the highest levels of military and intelligence command, packed her carefully crafted cover identity and prepared to become someone else entirely. The USS Constellation continued to patrol in the Pacific under Admiral Blackwell's transformed command, but everyone aboard knew that something fundamental had changed in the way their ship operated. From the newest recruit to the most experienced chief petty officer, they'd all witnessed what happened when someone had the courage to speak truth to power, even at great personal cost. They'd learned that sometimes the most important person on the ship isn't the one giving orders, but the one brave enough to say when those orders might be wrong. The oil platform that had been their target was successfully repaired by the civilian contractors whose lives had been saved by Kate's intervention. The environmental disaster that would have resulted from the platform's failure was prevented, and the facility continued its operation of providing energy resources while maintaining the highest safety standards. None of the workers ever knew how close they'd come to death, and that ignorance was perhaps the greatest gift they could have received. Admiral Blackwell kept a copy of the satellite imagery showing those civilian workers on his desk as a permanent reminder of the lesson he'd learned about the importance of listening to subordinates who might see things that experience and authority had made him blind to. Every time he was tempted to dismiss a concern or silence a dissenting voice, he looked at that image and remembered how close he'd come to becoming the kind of commander whose name will be remembered for all the wrong reasons. The story of what happened aboard USS Constellation spread quietly through naval circles, told in whispers among officers who understood that careers could be made or destroyed by the decisions made in moments of crisis. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the vital importance of maintaining open lines of communication between all levels of command. But for those who knew the full truth about Lieutenant Kate Morrison and her mission, it was something more. Proof that the Navy's most valuable assets weren't always its most visible ones. Sometimes they were the quiet professionals who worked in the shadows, preventing disasters that never made the news precisely because they never happened. Years later, when Admiral Blackwell retired from active duty with reputation as one of the Navy's most thoughtful and effective commanders, he would often speak to young officers about the importance of humility in leadership. He would tell them about the day when a lieutenant saved his career by challenging his authority, and how that experience had taught him that true strength comes not from never being wrong, but from having the wisdom to listen when someone is trying to help you avoid a catastrophic mistake. And somewhere in the vast Pacific Ocean, another ship with another admiral was being watched by another intelligence operative whose mission was to ensure that the lessons learned aboard USS Constellation would continue to protect innocent lives and preserve the honor of the United States Navy for generations to come. That was intense, but there's more where that came from. Click this video right now to see another underestimated officer shock everyone when her true identity is revealed, and she saves the day in ways no one could have predicted.